Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October 17th, for most people, edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. We are going to have a special themed call today. We're going to talk about migration, which has been a hot topic in certain circles, certainly at MakerDAO for the last couple of weeks. Before we launch into things, let me do the preamble then. So we have a lot of smart people in the call, a lot of very interesting opinions, lots of interesting viewpoints. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to ask them. Interrupt us, we don't mind. If you don't have access to a microphone, please type your question in the chat at the side, and we will read it out when the opportunity arises, and or we can deal with any off-topic questions at the end of the top of the next hour, when we'll spend 20 or 30 minutes in a general Q&A session. I think that's it for my preambles right now. What I want to do, though, is switch gears and start talking about something that is interesting, very, very interesting. So the idea is that for the uninitiated, we announced the impending launch of Multi-Collateral Dai. That's coming up soon. We have 4 or 5 calls between now and then. So from a governance perspective, this is rapidly approaching. And so there's things we need to begin to discuss. I've been warning the community for a while now that governance is about to start in earnest, and that we have some work ahead of us. And this is when that becomes a reality. So let's talk about what some of that work looks like. But first, let's review the reasons why we're all here working so diligently on what governance in the crypto space might look like. And what I want to do is talk briefly first about why we're doing this and what the outcome can be, and then we can talk about some of the challenges that we have facing us in the near term. I want to talk specifically about what MCD is all about, because it's easy to lose track of initialisms in this space and what their implications actually are. So multi-collateral Dai, I think, is a big deal for MakerDAO. It's a big deal for the protocol. It's a big deal for the ecosystem for numerous reasons. It's hard to actually keep them all in your head at once sometimes. But MakerDAO ultimately, MCD ultimately symbolizes the fact that MakerDAO is now open for business, and this represents a critical shift in the life cycle of the organization, because up until this point, we don't talk about this that much, but anymore. But single collateral Dai was a proof of concept. It's a beta test of a protocol that has a great deal of aspirations to be far greater than it is right now. And the thing that is constantly in the back of my mind is that we have a stable coin, and that coin is remarkably stable. But in my mind, the problem with that stable coin is there isn't enough of it. 80 million Dai in circulation is an achievement, but ultimately on a global stage, that's a hobbyist token. That's it's beyond niche. What MCD allows us to do is it opens up the door to taking the debt ceiling that we've been working with and 10 or 100xing that. And once we have significantly more Dai in circulation, we will begin to see some interesting things. And I always warn people against predicting the future, but I'll do it anyways. This opens the door to allow the partners that we've been incubating over the last couple of years, the big partners, to finally begin to engage with the system, because $80 million Dai is a nice number, but pick your average payment gateway, and that's actually just a rounding error. That's not going to be enough to bring significant volume and liquidity into the system. So what we need to do is we need to expand the scope of our operations, and MCD allows us to do that by allowing us to add more collateral types. It's as simple as that. As I'm sure Cyrus will agree. It's as simple as that. It also includes some other new mechanisms that are going to be important to us in the future. One of the things that goes unremarked often is the fact that the stability fee accrues on a regular basis, as opposed to hanging out. and waiting for Dai to be returned to the system. And if you take a quick tour of Etherscan, sorry, not Etherscan, InstaDApp, and the tool sets they have there, you can see that the single largest CDP in existence right now has just broken the 700,000 Dai stability fee outstanding. And that's something that isn't reflected in the day-to-day metrics that we gather for the system. And multi-collateral Dai will begin to see those things on a regular basis. That's going to be a big change for us. The onboarding of new collateral types, as I mentioned, it's a huge thing that allows us to begin to engage with the real world, and that's going to be important for the future of the ecosystem, and particularly for the future of our protocol. It also allows the Maker token holders, the governance system, to begin to build a portfolio of assets. And that's something that we'll be talking about in the future more than we have in the past, because our portfolio existed of Ethereum. But the collateral asset pool, the collateral assets that we'll be ingesting into the system can be viewed as a portfolio, and they have a relationship. Those assets have relationships with each other. They have relationships that some are correlated, some are uncorrelated, some have recourse issues, some don't. They need to be balanced. But once you balance those things, you end up de-risking. And the perception that adding additional collateral assets increases the risk in the system, I think, is, at least in my opinion, is unfounded. It can't be ignored that Ethereum itself holds risk. It holds regulatory risk. It holds technical risk. We've hitched single collateral Dai has hitched itself to a single leg. That's not great in this space. We're also going to be introducing the DSR, and this is huge in itself. What we've done is with the implementation of the DSR, we're altering the base layer of DeFi in some significant ways. We'll see a currency that has earning baked into it, earning that's value transfer from stability fees and CDP owners to stability seekers. That's significant paradigm shift. It also opens the doors to some other interesting behaviors we might begin to see, where one of the primary frictions in our space is that, and this is by design, it's the whole point of this thing, but every activity, every action on chain costs, it incurs a cost. And when you want to onboard people, explain to them that these new costs are a great thing can be a tough sell. The DSR allows organizations, players in the DeFi space, to begin to subsidize or explore opportunities for subsidizing activities on their own dApps, it's going to be fascinating to watch, and I'm looking forward to that. So we have a lot of things going on with MCD. The integrations teams are hard at work coordinating ecosystem actors, exchanges, aggregators, the Infuros of the world, the liquidity providers, helping them to understand the complexities of what it is that we have coming down the pipe. The MCD also introduces stronger security models, and these are things that are definitely outside the scope of the time I have allotted to me, but governance security modules, Oracle safety modules, emergency shutdown modules. There's a far larger tool set available to the governance ecosystem, which a significant number of levers that we can use to help mitigate risks to the system and incentivize its use. So there's so much going on right now. So those are all the good things about MCD. And so here's where that places our group and this forum here, is that we need to internalize some new realities. And part of this, I think the core of this new reality is the fact that up until this point, our job has been to manage a single universe that has some complexities to it, but ultimately we've all sort of arrived at the same point together, that our job is to maintain the stability of the peg, and the way that we do that is to bounce the stability fee appropriately and deal with improving the system and building up processes and procedures and working on communication. But ultimately, we had a single universe to deal with. And now, or not now, as of, I keep on jumping ahead, In the next 4 weeks or so, we're going to have 2 universes, and that changes things for us. We'll have the single collateral Dai universe, and we'll have the multi-collateral Dai universe. And when we launch multi-collateral Dai, the single collateral Dai universe doesn't go away. So we have two worlds to manage here. And so we need to start answering some questions fairly rapidly. It'll come with no surprise to people that have been in these calls for a while, but here, I'm not going to provide a lot of answers, but I am going to provide a lot of questions. And here's some of the questions we need to figure out. How long is this group, the governance ecosystem, how long is the ecosystem in general willing to support these 2 universes? How much overhead operationally, from a governance perspective, from the ecosystem perspective, can we maintain single collateral and multi-collateral? Is there a place for both in this brave new world, or do we need to figure out when a transition needs to take place? How do we ensure the stability of these 2 universes as we begin to migrate them? That's going to be complicated. How do we, as a governance group, remain agile enough and responsive enough to respond to these new challenges? And I'm not going to get into, Cyrus will tell us about those new challenges, but we have 2 pegs we need to maintain, and we had 1 peg before, so 2 pegs twice as hard at least. In order to, some of the levers that we're introducing that will allow us to maintain the multi-collateral universe are going to be new to us. We have different asset collateral types. We have the addition of the DSR. We have a new set of auction parameters. These are all things that we need to begin to build up processes and figure out how we're going to manage. That is going to be the rule of, or the order of the day. We have a lot of work to do. So the question now is, how do we move ahead in a way that guarantees stability for the ecosystem and ensures success of the protocol, allows us to maintain actors in the system where we don't exist in isolation as well, which is important to remember. There's an ecosystem that has grown up around us that we need to support. The way that I like to frame this is in the technology space. If you're a software developer, if you're lucky, you have the privilege or the opportunity to release an application, and that people uninstall the old application and install the new, or they upgrade in place. That's complicated, but it's not the worst thing in the world. It's important to understand that MakerDAO is different in many ways, and one of the ways that we are different is that we have a core protocol. We have various supporting networks that manage or augment that protocol, like the Oracle systems. We also have a series of dApps that depend on that Oracle or that core protocol directly. And essentially, or in many ways, and this may sound slightly immodest, but I'll do it anyways. You can consider the CDP engine and the DAI token itself as being part of a core API for the DeFi space. And so that means we have obligations to the rest of the ecosystem to manage this upgrade process responsibly. How we do that responsibly is ultimately, I think, a question of good governance and de-risking of that process. And de-risking is not my it's not my wheelhouse. It is Cyrus's and the risk team's wheelhouse. So I think I'm going to end my speechifying there. That was more than I had expected. If people have questions, please feel free to jump in and ask them now, or type them in the chat at the side. Otherwise, I think I might hand it over to Cyrus to start talking about some specifics for us.
Yeah, and I think I'm about to go on a fairly long rant as well. So if there are questions, either speak up or post them in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that as well. But I think, as Rich said, there is plenty to talk about. So yeah, I'm just gonna get right into it. So Rich, I think, did a really good job kind of describing all of the new improvements and upgrades that are coming with MCD. And I think there are even more that he still has yet to mention. So I think from a newcomer perspective, it's fairly straightforward. I think we can all expect that new users in the DeFi ecosystem will probably just start out with multi-collateral Dai. They won't necessarily even be aware of kind of what came before it. But of course, there is this big question of the existing single collateral Dai users and the CDP owners as well. I actually, this questions has been around global settlement and essentially what is the life cycle of single collateral Dai. So I think I want to just kind of tackle that from the start and get that out of the way, because I think that's maybe one of the more concerning aspects to the broader community and the broader DeFi ecosystem, although I don't think it's one of the biggest issues on the risk side. Okay, so generally people are asking what's going to happen with SCD, when might global settlement happen, what is the window for migration, and so forth. Ultimately, these are, of course, decisions for the community to think about and for us to discuss on this call and on the forums. Ultimately, the MKR holders are responsible for safeguarding of the user base. And part of that responsibility, I think, could involve kind of trying to take care of the existing users as optimally as possible, without forcing their hand necessarily, with minimum disruption. And I think essentially the idea of global settlement becomes more of a kind of almost a business decision than a risk decision per se, because there are certainly various ways to go about it. I think our job on the risk team is to kind of just explore the various proposals and describe the trade-offs and the risks involved. And certainly we will be doing that in the coming weeks. I think I do want to say that multi-collateral Dai has sort of been the kind of the full vision or realization of MakerDAO from the very start, whatever it was 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah, as Rich said, SCD was almost kind of an intermediary, a backstop of sorts. And I mean, if the community really wanted to keep this single collateral Dai product alive, I think there are various ways to do it. One of which Rune kind of had mentioned in the past few weeks is something called Purity Dai, just kind of an embedded siloed version inside of MCD. But I think the global settlement and SCD discussions are something that we can kind of keep coming back to over the coming weeks and months. It's certainly not something that's going to happen anytime soon. Migration can't be forced upon anybody. It's not just going to arbitrarily happen. And yeah, I mean, I think certainly we should come to a plan for what to do sooner rather than later for the benefit of the overall ecosystem. So especially kind of the broader DeFi partners, so everybody kind of know what's coming, but nothing has to be actually enacted in the immediate future. So anything about dates or 6 months or anything like that, I think is fairly misinformed at this time, given that it's a community decision to begin with. And of course, we're just getting started on these discussions right now. So that being said, before I jump into the actual migration mechanics, are there any questions on global settlement or SCD lifecycle, SCD timeline, anything like that?
Cyrus, I have a question on global settlement.
Sure.
So as I understand it, like from previous governance votes, say it's a stability fee. The way that the new state of the system is passed, say we want to enact an 8% stability fee and we're currently at 10%. the votes in favor of 8% need to outweigh the 10% in order for the new one to get enacted. That's how continuous voting works. So for global settlement, how does that work? Because currently, I don't think any MKR is currently voting for the single collateral die system. So how would a global settlement vote be passed?
Right. So the mechanisms behind how global settlement is triggered, I think is a bit more of a technical, it's kind of more of a technical aspect than a governance one, so to speak. So I think the general idea is that if the community wants to trigger global settlement via governance poll and so forth, I think it would be polled for and then enacted. I'm actually not even 100% sure on the engineering aspect of it, which is how I'm interpreting your question. So because I don't want to kind of spread misinformation, I would defer to one of the developers. But I can say that functionally, it would occur how we would do kind of any standard governance poll, in that it's a community decision and it's not something that's just going to arbitrarily happen, barring any, of course, other attacks or technical risks or whatever. I know that's not necessarily the answer you're looking for, but I think that's the best I can say right now.
Okay.
My understanding is that you could also like pass an executive vote to have the global settlement happen at a certain block time. So it would have to go through an executive vote ultimately.
Yeah, we're still discussing some of the thresholding that might be brought to bear on this kind of operation. So as the Gini coefficient or the dispersion, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. As the spread of maker across different holders changes, there's been talk of different minimum requirements to actually enact this global shutdown, but there's still mechanics that need to be fleshed out there.
Okay, cool. Let's talk a little bit about the migration itself. So the way to think about it is that we currently have two primary stakeholders. We have the DAI holders and we have CDP owners. And because MCD is also called DAI, it kind of introduces a lot of confusing terminology. So from this point going forward, and probably for the rest of the migration talks, we're going to refer to single collateral DAI as SAI, S-A-I. I think that was kind of the original name for SED actually, before it launched. And it just makes the conversation a lot easier to think about single collateral DAI as SAI and then multi-collateral DAI as DAI. All right, so essentially we have an existing set of SAI holders and an existing set of CDP owners. And the goal, presumably, is to seamlessly migrate over both SAI holders and CDP owners. And this sounds great in theory, but of course there are some risks involved, and operationally there's just 3 or 4 things we gotta just be aware of and plan for. Nothing terribly difficult, but I think the community certainly does need to be on the same page on this, for reasons that I was trying to describe earlier, that essentially the way migration will go down is more of a business operational consideration rather than a risk one. And I guess it would be kind of chaotic if there wasn't consensus on the path forward. Okay, so essentially we have roughly 85 million SAI, and if we want to migrate all that over to MCD, well, it's just a massive supply shock, right? You'd be winding down 85 million Psi and then spinning up 85 million Dai. And you know, one of the great things about Psi is that it's been around for 2 years. There's good liquidity, there's infrastructure, there's a large DeFi ecosystem, and MCD will not have any of that from the outset. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. It'll certainly have a good amount of DeFi adoption as well as exchange adoption due to efforts of the integrations team over the past several months. But just generally speaking, it obviously has not been around for 2 years to build up the same liquidity. And because of that, there are, I mean, if we're not careful, there are ways that this could go less than ideally. So, for example, a very naive way of doing a migration is to tell all the Psi holders to sell their Psi on the open market and then buy up Dai, right? That's just a very kind of rough way to do it. And of course, you'd end up causing a whole bunch of slippage, volatility, it'd just be kind of a mess all around, right? And similarly for CDP owners, imagine CDP owners trying to buy up a bunch of Psi on the open market, pay down their CDPs, unlock their collateral, relock it into MCD, draw out Dai, and then sell it again to establish their position, right? So it almost caused a pump and dump in Psi, and then a dump and repump in Dai. And I mean, depending on how quickly everyone might want to migrate over, certainly we can see some market chaos a little bit. So luckily, the brilliant engineers at the Maker Foundation have, you know, they've predicted a lot of these mechanics, and they've been thinking about this for a lot longer than most of us have. And so they have created this really awesome tool called the migration contract. And this was actually posted a few weeks ago as part of the GitHub. And I just posted a link in the chat, basically an upgrade guide, a migration guide. And we don't really get any questions or feedback on this within the community, on the Rocket Chat, anywhere. So I'm just kind of assuming no one has really read through it yet. So I'm just going to kind of explain it and go from there. So essentially the idea is to have Psi or the existing Dai to be a special collateral type for MCD. And this collateral type would have kind of very special risk parameters, have a stability fee of 0%, collateralization ratio of 100% or 1-to-1, and kind of I guess a fixed oracle price of just 1. And the idea is that any Psi holder can just open up a new CDP, deposit their Psi, and then just draw Dai against it. And as long as the debt ceiling is sufficient, then basically it's actually kind of in my mind, it's kind of an ingenious and seamless migration where anyone who's holding Psi can just immediately convert their Psi into Dai via this special CDP tool. And then from there, they can, of course, lock up their Dai into the DSR or do whatever with it. Does that make sense for the Psi migration mechanics? We're just talking mechanics here, not necessarily risks or trade-offs yet. Okay, cool. And then kind of the real interesting part is then how the CDP owners might migrate themselves. This same migration tool will allow CDP owners to then essentially atomically swap their CDP from SCD to MCD using that deposited Psi that was already migrated over. So, for example, let's say I'm a Psi holder and Rich is a CDP owner. I have 100 Psi. I can deposit into this special CDP and draw out Dai against it, and I'm basically done, on my way. And then Rich might have Rich was a CDP open with, say, 100 Psi of debt, can basically click a button, and the migration contract will take the Psi that I had deposited, use it to pay down his debt, move his collateral over, and then reestablish a CDP with an equivalent Dai debt of 100. And there are a few caveats with this. First is that there needs to be Psi in the deposit contract to facilitate the migration. So if I have not migrated first, then Rich cannot migrate himself. And then the second is that there's the issue of the stability fee that needs to be paid off first in MKR, because that is the only way. The only way to remove collateral is if the MKR governance fee has been paid off first. And so the migration contract will essentially check your wallet to see if you have sufficient MKR, and if you don't, then it will actually facilitate purchasing some MKR from a DEX like Oasis in the back end. And I think there's going to be special migration MKR liquidity there, and I believe that the integrations team is also releasing is open sourcing an arbitrage bot that can run on the DEXs for MKR liquidity as well. So I know that may have been a mouthful, but essentially it's actually really simple. Psi holders can migrate with one click, and CDP owners can also migrate with one click, given that there is Psi in the deposit contract and they have enough MKR to pay off their accrued stability fee.
Could I ask a question here?
Sure.
So you mentioned that there needs to be Psi in that contract for CDP owners to migrate.
Correct.
So there's a dependency on Psi holders wanting to move to Dai for CDP holders, for Psi CDP holders to move to
Exactly.
MCD CDP.
Right. So to be clear, no one needs to use the migration contract to migrate, although it's of course much easier. CDP owners could migrate manual if they wanted to. That being said, and I think this will come next week with kind of more specific detailed proposals, but pretty much any sort of DSR, say even 2% DSR, should kind of prime the pumps for Psi holders to want to migrate over prior to the CDP owners. That being said, I know a few of the major Psi holding partners to the Maker Foundation are also slated to migrate pretty much immediately or within a few days. So there should be a fairly decent sized chunk of Psi liquidity in the migration contract to help facilitate CDP owners to migrate.
Sweet.
Yeah, we've done a fair amount of work in kind of mapping out the different dependencies and what we can do to get ahead of potential pitfalls. So for example, I mentioned MKR liquidity on the DEXs to kind of prevent any major slippage from occurring during the CDP migration. Psi liquidity, of course, and a few other things as well. Any questions in the chat?
Hey, Cyrus, do you imagine any type of Psi price disruption, given that, if liquidity goes down at some point, and if there's not enough Psi in the contract, any type of Psi price disruption that MKR holders will then have to step in and help balance? Or do you imagine that liquidity will always be there, or in the background, there'll always be some type or some amount of Psi liquidity in the contract?
Right. So yeah, so the risk aspect of it is, it's essentially kind of, we need to build consensus within the community on how we want to do it. And this is kind of why I think me and Rich keep referring to that this will be a conversation that cannot finish today, and it'll probably take several weeks to play out. And I think hopefully next week we'll be able to put out some more specific documents with kind of scenario analysis and contingency plans. Essentially, the idea is, though, at least one idea, which is possibly optimal from a perspective of safety or minimal disruption, is to, I think we spoke about this on the Rocket Chat, right, is to kind of have the DSR positioned in a way that we can kind of ensure Psi liquidity is there prior to CDP owners wanting to migrate over. And I think if we just kind of take some care with the DSR, I don't anticipate liquidity issues there, because I think there's just naturally more benefits for Psi holders to be migrating over prior to CDP owners anyways.
What I was referring to earlier about agility. There's going to be we have levers available to us, and it depends. We're largely going to be driven by the activity of a large group of stakeholders whose motivations and actions we cannot completely predict. So if lots of people move lots of Dai immediately, we'll have to respond in one way. And if not many people move at all, we'll have to respond in a different way. So it's going to be a matter of pulling the levers that are available to us at the appropriate moment, largely driven by recommendations from risk, I'm hoping.
Another important detail is that the migration contract can facilitate Psi to Dai as well as the other way around. So people will be able to convert their Dai back into Psi as well. So people will be able to arb between the two pegs if necessary.
Yeah, there's some interesting mechanics there as well in terms of the relative price of Psi to Dai. Psi should pretty much never be below the Dai price, because you can always move from Psi to Dai using the special CDP. And then the reverse also holds true as long as there is Psi in the deposit contract. So I'm not expecting any relative price deviations between Psi and Dai, although of course there might be deviations relative to the dollar peg. And then so that's where we have to start thinking about, well, this actually just kind of segs into my next section, which is as long as we prep for contingency plans, I think I'm confident that things will be totally fine. But some of the things we have to worry about are essentially monetary policy for Psi and Dai, our agility with governance calls, if we need to increase the cadence, if we need to carve out any special procedures for any kind of spontaneous governance calls should the need arise. I think an interesting question is level of delegation from the community to the risk team. So for example, we could come out and kind of put forth a few different ideas, or we could kind of just come to consensus on one and essentially say, let the risk team just do its thing as long as it follows a pre-agreed mandate of what the goals are. And yeah, I think this is just things we're going to have to get through. There are, I think the idea is that overwhelmingly that there are so many kind of positive aspects and benefits to upgrading, both for SAI holders and CDP holders, that our expectation is that kind of the default case is that everything runs smoothly. DSR should kind of, should incentivize a lot of SAI holders to move over, and CDP owners similarly will enjoy benefits as well from increased liquidity on the, well, I shouldn't say increased liquidity, but liquidity will be an interesting thing to manage, right? Because I know that, I know a bunch of centralized exchanges are essentially getting ready to do a upgraded token, whatever. They're going to basically be switching from SAI to DAI, and I believe the Oasis app is also going to move from SAI to DAI. And so essentially, I do think that very quickly after launch, DAI will kind of have a very sizable chunk of liquidity attached to it that would be beneficial for CDP owners going forward. Of course, we'll have to see how that plays out, but that's the goal. So the idea is that there are there's numerous advantages for migrating for the whole ecosystem, right? And then we just kind of have to worry about the edge cases and build out some contingency plans, and then share them with the community, build some consensus, have some discussions, and take it from there. Any questions so far? Although I'm getting close to wrapping up. All right, so then I guess the last thing I want to talk about is how the whole migration governance cycle plays into kind of the more standard risk models that we've been kind of building up to for MCD for a while now. As you know, myself, Vishesh, Primosh, and a few others have been hard at work kind of building out some collateral risk models. And these were supposed to kind of be the standard operating procedure going forward. And I think under normal circumstances that would apply, but I think given the immense supply shock of the migration, that they almost, you know, any concept of risk premiums and so forth really takes a back seat, right? I think ensuring the stability of the peg is the primary concern. Kind of the way I think about it is that when you look at any collateral asset, you can evaluate it and determine its risk premium, but then you have to balance out the monetary policy aspect afterwards, right? Through DSR or stability fee adjustments, kind of what we've been doing all year, really. In this case, it doesn't matter if the asset is something super safe, like treasuries or whatever, something super risky, or just ETH or whatever. The fact that we are bringing in such a potentially large amount of DAI at inception kind of necessitates a special migration risk and governance cycle where we kind of select risk parameters that are most suitable to that. So, for example, if you know, if our new stability fee was designed to be something, say, 5%, I think it would be kind of careless to just start off with a spread that large and trigger some enormous amount of potential refinancing or whatnot. Right? If we were to do that, then it would pretty much immediately require a tightening of that spread to balance out the monetary policy. So I think we can just kind of think one step ahead and just work on the migration, which probably take maybe a couple weeks, probably through mid-December. at the very, very earliest. And then, of course, we hit the holidays. So my expectation is that starting in the new year, we can start to work on more proper risk and governance cycles. And we still plan on putting out all of our documentation in the coming weeks. I just don't think that they will be very applicable to the unique situation we're facing ahead of us right now.
So Cyrus, is all of that to say that that a lot of the parameters that are going to be there, for example, like with the ETH CDP and MCD, are going to be set in a way that is probably conservative and more safe rather than accurate? So like the risk modeling, and then afterwards, governance can tune it more towards the actual risk models that those collateral types and parameters kind of demand.
Yeah.
Command.
Yeah, something like that. I think that's along the lines of thinking.
Okay, cool.
And to be clear, what those migration risk parameters might be, that's still, of course, an open question. I'm sure we will revisit this discussion next week, kind of after the community's had some time to digest all of this. And I mean, if you spend some time thinking about it, there's actually multiple ways to do migration. It just kind of becomes an operational question of what is our objective? What are we trying to optimize for? Is it the pace of the migration? Are we trying to get this in as fast as possible? Are we optimizing for the safety of our existing user base, which is what I would expect it is, or something else entirely, right? My guess is that we're going to probably put out a proposal that optimizes for minimal disruption and kind of safe and seamless migration for SCI holders and CDP owners, and just leave it at that. But I'm certainly interested in seeing if people think that there are other considerations we should be factoring in. All right, I'm done. We can certainly do questions at the turn of the hour, but maybe we get Vishesh in quickly before the turn of the hour.
Sounds good. Yeah, I also want to give LongForWisdom an opportunity to speak to, because there's been some interesting things happening in the forums that we shouldn't ignore as well. But let's take care of that at the top of the hour. Vishesh, are you all ready to go?
Sure. So I'll try to be cognizant of time as well. All right. So again, long story short, as far as pricing goes for DAI, things have been pretty stable at and above $1. We've kind of actually seen sustained now for a few weeks, more or less this spread with, maybe 60% or so of the, maybe a little bit more than that, of the DAI that's trading above $1. With the average, around $1.05, and the trading volume has been a little bit low lately, just below 2 million. But if we look at sort of the 7-day time scale, again, that same spread reflected, but slightly on track trading volume, maybe 13, 14 million. So again, averaging out to about 1 million, 2 million traded per day. Huge market share of the trading volume for Oasis over the last week or so, maybe a little bit higher than normal. So that's interesting to note. But yeah, this has been a pretty steady trend. I mean, you can sort of see here on the longer term graph, like the majority of the DAI being traded is trading above $1, and is trading about halfway between $1 and $1.01. And with a few moments sort of some run up above or some run up below, but generally more run up above over the past month or so. So interesting, when we spoke last week, what we kind of touched on was there was this recent spike in the amount of DAI drawn out, and we were curious to see what would happen to the supply from there. It's basically sustained most of that run up and then come down very slightly with a few large wipes, also a few small draws, but more or less netting out to a slight decrease in supply. As far as collateral goes, so there's been some fluctuation a little bit more than usual recently, where there was a fair amount of collateral that was removed, but also some collateral that was added, netting out to just a slight increase in the amount of collateral in the past week, but that's just following up a slight decrease last week. So basically more or less level in terms of the amount of collateral in the system. And this is following essentially a slight run up in ETH prices and then coming back down, maybe a majority of that distance anyway. So it's a little bit of a parabolic arc. All in all, I would call that pretty quiet activity. Just going back up some of these longer term trends. So essentially the amount of collateral being locked has kind of been consistently growing over time. The amount of collateral that was being removed, as we noted, was growing more quickly, and then basically around August started to slow down and has maintained that slightly slower rate. As far as the amount of DAI being drawn out, that we had noticed had slowed down around the beginning of August, and this kind of maintained that new sustained rate, but the amount of DAI being wiped also slowed down. It just slowed down to a slightly lower level. So we saw a slight overall increase in supply basically over the past month or so. Jumping over to a couple of the relationship graphs. So essentially, again, pretty solid sustained relationship between ETH price and liquidations. So essentially when we see these more volatile moments of a jump following a dip in ETH price, that tends to coincide with when we see more liquidations occurring. So very few liquidations in the last few weeks. As far as collateral and ETH price, so again, the users of the system tend to maintain this more or less inverse relationship between what happens with ETH price and the nominal amount of collateral that's put into the system. So effectively, that's risk management in action. And then the DAI supply with the ETH price. So as mentioned, DAI supply has kind of fluctuated a bit more than usual lately, even though the ETH price had only slightly run up and then slightly dipped. So it's interesting, I think in the last month or so, we saw a little bit more responsiveness of the supply to changes in ETH price. Curious if that's kind of a renewed appetite for activity, and then people are just trying to find the right prices at which they want to take those actions. So as far as what's been going on in secondary markets, so just here a little bit. So what we saw essentially is the borrow rate for DYDX is highly unpredictable, but the borrow rate for Compound has kind of kept that sustained buffer to the stability fee. So this is a pretty interesting relationship. Usually this was arbitraged away or resulted in a large quantity of refinancings, but this has actually kind of been sustained for the past couple of weeks. So it'll be interesting to continue to watch if it does ever dip back below, or if we've just kind of hit that that floor. So the borrow volumes, again, this contributes to why there hasn't been a huge change in those rates, is that over the last week or so, the borrow volumes for DYDX and Compound have been pretty flat. So not much change there. So it contributes to pretty flat rates. The supply volume has very, very slightly increased over the past week. Again, so tiny changes in borrow and supply volume leading to relatively no change in rates. The utilization rates, again, a very slight increase in the excess, so a very slight dip in the utilization rate. But yeah, actually all in all pretty quiet, I would say. Sorry. that was it. I will leave it up for questions if there are.
All right, let's let people stew on that for a second then. Just another reminder that we're going to have the Q&A at the end of the call. So collect any migration, MCD, or state of the peg questions you have, and then we can get them all taken care of at the end. There's one question from Aaron. Vishesh, are you in the mood for giving us guidance? Is this going to be the day when you tell us what to do?
I mean, there's very little activity in terms of the metrics in the past week or so. So that really, to me, doesn't speak to any need for any changes, especially considering the fact that the compound borrow rate is still above the stability fee. So, like, to me, that speaks to market conditions that really don't necessitate any changes at the moment. But I'm curious to know if anybody has any different thoughts.
Well, I have a question for you. I'm hesitant to ask because it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I want to go to sleep, but I'll do it anyways. We see the volume weighted average graphs, and in the chats, people are fairly interested in continuing to lower the stability fee. And one of the things, and this isn't a leading question, I'm actually this dumb. So I don't understand what the motivation is to optimize for hundredths of a percent of the peg, and maybe I'm missing something. So do you think that are people just naturally inclined to want to like create some symmetry on that VWAP graph, or we want the red line in the middle of that arc, or is there a reason for us to sort of chase this perfect stability?
So as simple as we would like to make these things, they are always generally more complex than we're all willing to admit. So one of the things I would consider is there's trade-offs to everything, right? So if it is consistently known that DAI, or Psi actually, trades consistently above $1, then my guess, and we haven't heard from any market makers on these calls in a little while, but based on the conversations I've had with folks, it's my understanding that those kinds of groups are rather encouraged by the idea that DAI can consistently trade above $1, and that can be a known fact. So even if it is erring a little bit on the side of caution, it, I think, improves the arbitrage use case and probably makes market makers' lives a bit easier, because it should theoretically improve the willingness of some OTC players to take bets on Psi. So that's definitely a trade-off, and I'm saying, I don't think that the people that generally are always pushing for the stability fee to be lowered are necessarily consisting that. I love that Lix just shared that transaction. The timing is perfect. But yeah, I mean, so there are people that are consistently pushing for rate decreases. I'm not sure that those people are necessarily considering that use case. But there are also people on both sides of the peg, I guess, that are equally polarized, right? So that's what I've noticed about the maker community is it's very good at polarizing opinions. And so like you have those that are consistently always pushing for a decrease, and you have those that are consistently always pushing for an increase. And what I've noticed, at least from chats, Twitter, et cetera, is that it tends to be like one group that has a dominant voice at the time, and then at a later time, other groups will have a dominant voice, and it kind of switches off, and it's kind of a funny thing to observe. But I think at the moment, we're kind of in a state where those that are pushing for an increase feel more comfortable being louder. Pushing for a decrease feel more comfortable being a bit louder. I think that's one of the things that we do tend to notice in this time. I don't know if it's necessarily because they're chasing, 0.2 of a percentage point on DAI or on Psi peg so much as, well, it makes the use case of drawing out more supply a little bit more attractive. And I'm sure it makes certain lines of business and certain products a little bit easier because there's a little bit less cost. And I would guess that would be more of the motivation. But I do think a lot of people tend to use the maintenance of the peg as a justification. I wouldn't imagine that's what everyone's always optimizing for.
It's an interesting thing to watch. Yeah, I think this is something we're going to see more and more of in the future, is that this a brighter line between the hawks and the doves and the CDP owners and the DAI holders and all the rest of it. But yeah, I guess maybe I wasn't looking at it as deeply as you obviously have been, and I was wondering if it was just people failing to zoom out far enough on the graph, and that was what was causing the contentions. But I'm obviously not an analyst. All right, if there's not any additional questions for Vishesh, we have to come up with a nickname for you. LongForWisdom, would you like to give us a governance and governance recap?
Yeah, I can do. There's not been that much discussion on the forums. It's been pretty quiet again. I don't know if that's like DevCon hangover or just people are kind of shell-shocked from the MCD announcement. But yeah, so there's been a little bit of discussion about the some of the collateral onboarding proposals, like the fund one especially. A bunch of people were discussing that. And then Lix's thread about the PID got revived. A couple of people posted some thoughts on that. The main thing that I thought was important to bring up was the signal request thread on increasing the SCD debt ceiling, or the side debt ceiling, I guess. So we finished the latest poll finished a week and a bit ago, I think. And
yeah, I want to apologize personally for releasing MCD in the middle of that. I know that you worked on that thread for so long. Sorry about that, man.
Yeah, it was really inconsiderate, but I understand. So yeah, we've got. So the result of the last poll was that we had, I think it was. Let me just check. So yeah, we had 56%. I was remembering right. Consensus to go with option 3, which was a commitment to increase the SCD debt ceiling by 10 million each time the total supply of DAI comes within 10 million of the current debt ceiling. Which is interesting because rather than being a single thing that we can now do, this is a kind of ongoing commitment that someone needs to like operate, I guess.
Well, it's interesting. It's a divergence from agreeing to take a single reactionary response to a stimulus to creating a procedure that just automatically kicks in the future, which is interesting. I don't think we've done something like that before.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's probably good because it's leading us away from doing lots of governance votes, which is kind of beneficial because they're a lot of work for everyone. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know if we'll see more of that coming up, maybe with the migration, but we'll see how it goes. Specifically with this one, like implementation kind of comes down to, I guess, probably you.
Yeah, more work for me, I guess. So this raises some really interesting questions, though, because the language in these debates or these discussions that we have in the forums are important, because changing the language and or modifying them at the 11th hour can be viewed as being shady, I guess, or manipulating governance. So the way that the process was framed is in SCD, we will do this, and in the this and that example was to raise the debt ceiling when we get close to the debt ceiling. So the question, I think, for the community right now is this something that we still feel strongly about in light of the fact that the migration is coming and MCD launch is coming? And there's obviously pros and cons on both sides that need to be discussed. Cyrus has already made a good point a couple times that it's impossible for us to predict exactly how long these two universes will exist. A single class, or Psi, sorry, I guess I should get on script here. Psi might be around for a while. So there's it's entirely possible that the debt ceiling will still need to be managed. If all things go according to plan, presumably every week the debt ceiling or the amount of circulating psi will decrease. It's a risky prediction to make, right?
And one interesting thing to consider now, and this is why we keep emphasizing the community to kind of come to consensus on migration strategy, is that let's say for whatever reason the community says, okay, we want to kind of help shepherd this migration and potentially minimize any risks associated with it, right? And so one aspect there might be to actually reduce the debt ceiling every few weeks, right? Let's say the Psi supply has dropped to 60 million, then maybe at that point you consider reducing the Psi debt ceiling from 100 to 80, for example. Like if that's what was perceived to be the safer migration strategy that everybody wanted to go with. So there's kind of competing strategies here for how we want to deal with Psi that is entirely dependent on the appetite for the pace of migration and the safety of migration that we want to set collectively, right? Because like, let's say Psi supply is down to 20 million and you leave that 80 million buffer there, then right, you could conceive of some issues there. So yeah,
what is the specific risk of having too much headroom in the debt ceiling? So if it is at 20 and the debt ceiling's at 80, the risk is that some whale would come in and have that $60 million Dai buffer with which to get up the shenanigans.
Well, I know for MCD, it's definitely a risk due to the Oracle security module, the 1 hour delay. So if there's like a huge price crash, let's say an asset drops to 0, then anyone would have an hour to basically max out the borrowed Dai before the price feed reflects it. And the more empty debt ceiling room there is, the more they can abuse that. So certainly in MCD, there has to be kind of as minimal slack that is tolerable there. That doesn't quite apply to SCD, but I think just in general, like you wouldn't want to leave open this scenario where someone can just create 80 million Dai, 80 million Psi, right? I haven't exactly thought it through, but generally speaking, it's just an idea. I'm not saying that's the right path to go, but I think now with the migration and with MCD launch, certainly room for reevaluating the debt ceiling pool as it was put forth to the community.
Yeah, I think like the original context for doing it was before the announcement, right? So we didn't know how long it was.
Right.
That said, so the wording of the poll is specifically until MCD launches. So by default, it would cease to take effect. Like, I mean, this is the thing. It's already voted on chain, right? But if it was voted through, then by default it would expire. At the launch of MCD. So we could then policy for.
That's really great that it was worded like that.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, if SCD continues forever after MCD launches, then it makes it seem a little bit silly. But
I mean, at the same time, people have to like consider the new context, right? We can't use like old poll results to do things in the new world, so to speak.
This is kind of the question, right? Because the announcement was like halfway through this process and halfway through this poll. So how do you then interpret the results? At least I think it was it after it?
Right.
Might have been after it. I forget.
Philippe brings up an super interesting question. One that I've personally spent some time thinking about. He says, why are any active measures necessary at all to push people to MCD? Shouldn't the market eventually converge to MCD if it's better. That's a great point. And I think the answer, at least in my opinion, certainly has to do with MKR holders and their prerogative to manage kind of the entire MakerDAO ecosystem in the manner that they think is best for the community, for DAI holders, for MKR holders, for everybody, right? Both from risk perspective and a growth perspective and so on.
Well, the interesting question here is, what does converge? I hate to do this because this is what nerds do all the time, but what does converge actually mean? So, it's not going to be binary. We're not going to. I don't think we're ever going to reach a point where there's literally zero circulating psi, right? So at some point you have to. The community needs to decide, like, okay, like at this point, 1 million circulating psi is now an officially a dead ecosystem, and now we have to do something about that. Right, like there has to be some point, right, where we have to figure out what the threshold is, don't we? At which we can consider convergence has occurred on one or other ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think some best estimates have to do with kind of liquidity, transaction volume, transaction count, that kind of stuff. What the thresholds are, I think we can figure out later. But actually, I think I think the kind of the interesting part of that question actually is just a variant of why MCD in the first place. Why does anybody need to upgrade to MCD if SCD is working just fine? And I do think that there are significant upgrades in the security of MCD that almost obsoletes SCD in a lot of ways, to the point that SCD could even be considered overly risky or unnecessarily risky, given that we have better and more advanced tools ahead of us. One being just the existence of multiple or diversified collateral types certainly is an important benefit, assuming that all the recourse issues work themselves out. But even things like the DSR, the governance security module, all that kind of stuff, I think, is actually somewhat critical to the security, to the increased security of MCD. And so that being said, I mean, if MKR holders truly believe that, then I think it would be logical for them to somewhat incentivize the migration to occur.
All right, it feels like we're getting close to awkward silence countdown.
So I do have maybe a more general question. Do we have like a general outline of the stuff we're going to be covering in the governance calls over the next 4 weeks?
Yeah, we do actually.
Are we going to post anything about it
we should
before
share
the
that.
calls?
We are actually, but now that you bring it up, I can run through it if I remember where I wrote them down. Right. Okay. Yeah. So next week, I think we can actually kind of maybe discuss some potential like hard parameter estimates for MCD, risk parameters for not only for ETH but for the special psi CDP, as well as what isn't certainly intended to be a launch collateral type, which is a BAT, basic attention token. So I think next week we can kind of maybe put out a plan for good risk parameters with the objective of a safe migration. I think the week after that, at some point, we're going to have to discuss auction parameters because MCD introduces 3 new auction types, right? A collateral auction, an MKR auction, and a surplus auction as well. And they're kind of special on-chain Ethereum-like auctions, which kind of require a bit of nuance and some discussion there. So we'll probably spend a call talking about auctions. Maybe spend another call talking about the new security features like the governance security module and how we might use those to our advantage, what the parameters might be over there.
I'm sorry, Cyrus, you said the governance security module parameters, that's in the same week as the parameters around auction parameters?
No, I'm thinking maybe another,
even further.
the week
Okay,
after
cool.
that.
Yeah.
And then I think there's just one more call after that, which is where we can do some final wrap-up stuff.
Interspersed between those documents, though, we're going to have to have a few polls and a few
right.
Start coming to consensus about some of the decisions that we're making leading up to the launch.
Right. We'll have to do polls, and then yeah, I think that's kind of the tentative schedule for now.
Cool. Thank you so much. So Aaron is asking, when is the expected ETA on the MCD white paper?
Actually, I think Wouter is in the call here, so maybe he wants to chime in.
That's perfect timing. Hey, Wouter.
Hey, Wouter.
Hi, everyone. That was not planned. I was intending to leave all the work to you guys, but the white paper, it's kind of a big word. What it will be probably is just a corrected version of the white paper that's currently online and linked on our website. And I know Rune has been working on it. When it will be ready, I'm not sure. It's something that, yeah, we should ask him and get back on. But I guess it wouldn't be, if we prioritize it, we can probably push it out quite soon. No one within the foundation is like really waiting for it because, as I said, it's mostly just an update of the white paper that we already have online. But it's definitely something that, yeah, we should check off and make sure that we get it in place. So
I'm just curious, is this more than a nice to have at this point? Do people in the community feel strongly that
well, that's what I wanted to ask Aaron is we have a significant amounts of documentation and all the codes out there, and we have piles of explainers in GitHub that probably go to far greater detail about what it is we're launching. So Aaron, what is it about the white paper that you find compelling that you wanted to see?
I think, and while Aaron might be typing this, I think maybe a part of it is that the white paper in general is kind of like a really big meme in the crypto community. It's kind of like the one point of reference for maybe technical people or new people to come and like see a technical explanation of everything. And those exist. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Those exist.
I don't think that anybody's arguing that we should definitely have a white paper out there. And ours has been out of date for far too long.
Yeah. So Aaron writes, only reason I ask is because I was just following Rich's release schedule from weeks ago and it never came out. Just thought it needed to be released before we move forward. So that's referencing the roadmap that we released.
Yeah, and Aaron, I agree. It should be released. And so we'll do some follow-up.
Yeah, so the corrected paper, it's something that we can get out pretty quickly. I think one other thing to note that's important is that usually the white paper, it functions as documentation, right? But of course, since we're in the situation where things have already been implemented, we actually have much more specific documentation with all the details that you would usually look into the white paper for. But yeah, we have the specific technical documentation. So that is something that does make the white paper a little bit more of a nice to have, but still as a summary and as an overview of the system, it's something that we should have. Yeah, we can definitely publish that corrected version before the launch of MCD.
Now that you've made the mistake of joining, Wouter, Akiva has a question you might be able to answer. Can the MCD code change after the audit reports have been published?
Yeah, the white paper definitely does not imply code freeze. It implies freeze of the functionality, but that's something very different. And so as we are progressing through our security roadmap, so we are still processing the results of the different audits that we've done. And we're still like changing some minor details as we are working through the exact machinations of definitely of the migration, and also how the smart contracts interact with the higher level layers. So the functionality won't change anymore. It's just and there might be some details that change, like maybe yeah, an additional method being added to the smart contracts for convenience reasons, or a specific event being emitted that because it was really difficult to get some particular piece of data from the smart contracts, those kind of things. And then obviously security improvements like additional assertions, additional checks, whatever, things that are strictly speaking not necessary, but that are just an improvement in terms of security and reliability. So those are the kind of changes that currently might still be introduced to the system. And yeah, of course, you can always see what we have done in our recent releases. If you go to changelog.makerdao.com, you will find all the changes that we've been adding to the contracts. Yeah, and I guess the reason why people would say that after the security audits that there will be no changes anymore is because then you might, if it's a significant change, then you might have to redo like part of the security audit. But those are not definitely the kind of changes that we're still doing. So the changes are very minimal and yeah, specific to these last improvements before we launch the system.
Maybe another question for you, Wouter, would be the status of formal verification on the contracts outside of the core contracts. Like, what's the process? I know that not all of the contracts with MCD launch are formally verified, and that's okay, but what's the process of, like, is it just like a sign off, or if we do want them to be formally verified or like improve the code somehow post launch, would there need to be like governance actions to amend that code? Yeah.
Yes, so we're at the point where the core contracts are formally verified, and the most important ones outside of that core. In particular, we do have a contract that's called the CDP Manager, which is like a front-end contract that makes it more convenient to use the functionality of the core. And that one will also be formally verified. So all in all, I don't think there will be too many contracts that won't be formally verified. If the ones that aren't are typically for, like for example, the S-Chief is a good example, right? So the problem is that at one point the functionality of for example, the single collateral Dai contracts feeds into the MCD system, and that the result of that is that you cannot fully formally verify the entire system, because in order to do that, you would have to verify the migration and you would have to verify the full single collateral Dai system. And the same argument can be made on the side of the collateral contracts. So the collateral adapter contracts cannot be fully formally verified, because it would imply full formal verification of the entire token contract and the system that sits behind it, right? So that's a kind of restrictions that we're talking about. That being said, our security roadmap is an ongoing effort. So our bug bounty program, for example, will continue unchanged until even after the launch. So there is no end date. And as we will be adding additional modules to the system, and indeed those will have to be voted in through governance, unless they are optional, like unless they don't need a specific permission in the system, unless they are simply like, for example, a new front-end contract that uses a new or introduces a new way to access a core system that might be introduced without governance, because people aren't forced to use it. It's just a convenience thing. And then it will be up to us as the community to decide like what the security standard is, right? And you mentioned on the community call, I believe, David, the maker improvement proposals. So that will actually be an interesting vehicle to set those standards. So as we will be publishing our proposal for the initial the starting process, then we can get into more detail about what exact security standards we expect as a community when the MCD system is extended with new modules, or particular modules are replaced, or other additions to the system.
Nice, thanks. And then I have one more question. Sorry for keeping you guys so long, but in regards to DS Chief and how voting is going to happen between both systems, is it going to be one DS Chief controlling the two systems? Is that like on a technical level? What's the role of DS Chief? Is there going to be two DS Chiefs, or
Yeah, so to start out with, it will be the same DS Chief that is being used for both systems. And so one of the improvements there that we want to introduce in the longer term is a DS Chief, a fully formally verified governance layer. And the problem there is, as I mentioned, you can't really do it right now, because it would require a full formal verification of the single collateral Dai system, and also the current version of DS Chief isn't really amenable to formal verification. As you might remember, the core contracts have been designed from the ground up in a way that is particularly well suited for formal verification, and this wasn't done for DS Chief. So if we would create a new formal verified version, then it would be slightly different. The functionality would be the same, but the code would be different. Now, so what we want to do is, once the system has been deployed, in the beginning it will be just the DS Chief version that we have currently online, and then at one point in the future we would upgrade to a new formally verified version of DS Chief, one that might also add some additional functionality to improve the upgrading process. Because as we are progressing in our thinking about these systems, what we are paying more and more attention to is upgradability. And obviously we're learning from experiences such as the DS Chief upgrade that happened some time ago due to the vulnerability that was discovered. We saw that it wasn't the easiest thing to upgrade DS Chief, and we could actually think about some mechanisms to, first of all, as I mentioned, formally verify it, and then secondly, to also facilitate the upgrading process. So yeah, we're still very much thinking those things through, but that is something that we're planning to do at one point.
Got it. So am I right in saying that the governance of the two systems will still be able to be handled by one dashboard, and that I know our product team, we discussed on the offsite that votes and stuff will be tagged with like SCD versus MCD, but everything will basically be handled on one contract. So the governance will not be like fractured in any way between systems migration.
Yeah, yeah, that's correct.
Okay, cool. Good to know.
All right, I think that might be a good place to end things for the week. That was an action-packed call. Lots of information to process. As we talked about at the top of the hour, or top of the previous hour, we're going to be launching into a migration cycle for governance, and we have a lot of things to discuss. And Cyrus will be bringing us some more information, some more resources to the next call, and we can begin digging in to the mechanics of the operation. So it's going to be a good call. So I look forward to seeing everybody again next week. Thank you, Cyrus, for your recap. Thank you, LongForWisdom and Vishesh, for your summaries as well. Thank you, Wouter, for providing technical insight. I'm going to actually invite you explicitly to all these calls from now on. So enjoy that. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. See you next week.